Hello and welcome to this episode of the Bible Toolbox. I'm Luke.
And I'm Lydia. And in our previous episode, we talked all about Bible translations and why they differ. And in this episode, we get the chance to interview and talk with Leland Ryken, who was on the translation committee for the ESV. So he was helping them make this translation, but he had a kind of an important role.
Yeah, so he was the English stylist. And what that means is he was in charge of making sure that the English was good. So that maybe sounds weird, but on Bible committees, it's not just Greek and Hebrew scholars. They also need people to make sure that it accords with good English. And so one mistake that I made in our interview is I shorted him. He was actually a professor for 52 years at Wheaton as an English professor. So he knows English better than
well.
most people in the world.
Yeah. So, and just so you know, our conversation with him is audio only. So if you're watching the video of this, there's no video. It's just two still pictures, one of Leland and one of us, but there's no video. And every resource that we mention, the books and that kind of thing, are all posted on our website. So feel free to check those out. So hope you enjoy.
Hello and welcome to the Bible Toolbox, where we seek to help you enjoy the Bible through the tools that scholars and programmers have created for you. We are excited today to have Professor Emeritus of English at Wheaton College, where he taught 43 years, is Leland Ryken. He was also the literary stylist for the ESV and has written many, many books, including one that I've had to use in multiple of my classes called How Bible Stories Work, published in 2015. And then probably the one that we'll be focusing on the most today is a book called The ESV and the English Bible Legacy, published by Crossway in 2011. And so welcome, Leland.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.
So tell us about yourself and how you decided to become an English professor and how you ended up being on the ESV committee.
Well, I self-identify right to the present day as the farm boy from Iowa. I come from very humble origins. Neither of my parents graduated from grade school. They were needed to work on the farm. Only in recent years has it occurred to me, I grew up in an immigrant subculture. I became a professor of English just by following in the steps of my older sister, who from high school was headed toward being a high school English teacher, she thought. I just naturally assumed I would do the same thing. It didn't turn out quite that way. I earned a PhD in English literature and then came to teach in the English department at Wheaton College. I became literary stylist for the English Standard Version by an unusual path. When the NIV was first published, Christianity Today asked me to review its literary qualities. I gave it a negative review. This caught the attention of Lane Dennis, president of Crossway Books. He engaged me in conversation about my review in the narthex of the church that we both attended. I did not remember the conversation, but through the years, Lane has repeatedly referenced it and talked about its formative influence for him. That is what led Lane to ask me to become the literary stylist of the ESV, but it also played an important part in the decision to produce an alternative to the dynamic equivalent translations that had become the norm.
Very cool. So what was it like working with the ESV translators, or like what did a day in the life of you working on this look like?
Well, for the experience as a whole, I can say it was exhilarating. I find it hard to imagine my scholarly career without it. It played an important part in my life for 2 decades, partly because after the ESV appeared, I then published several books on translation theory. The translation committee held its 2-week meetings over a span of 5 years, half of them in England, half in the US. Meeting in England made it all the more special, and the wives attended the meetings as well, so it became a very important event in my life. The daily meetings were pretty grueling. We met from 8 until 5. I learned a lot about the process. Ultimately, everything that appears in an English language translation is the result of a vote. I remember that when the NIV appeared, someone who was working on that committee spoke in chapel at Wheaton College, and he spoke at one point of how agonizing it was to argue for a position all morning long, quote unquote, and then lose the vote. I sat in disbelief. I said to myself, do you mean to tell me that an English Bible translation is the result of a vote? Well, that was then, and now is now. I now know that at some level, every word that appears in an English Bible translation is the result of a vote.
Is it normally a pretty split vote, or is it like a good consensus? Not every word is as grueling, hopefully.
It's a consensus. The way had been paved because long before we even came to the meeting, we had been given tentative translations. We had already cast a vote by way of a written comment. There were some votes that took long meetings. The word doulos in the New Testament took a whole morning of debate, for example. For the most part, the votes went quickly. I wanted to recount one incident because it kind of encapsulates the experience. I remember an occasion when J.I. Packer argued more strongly for a translation of a verse than I have ever seen him argue before or since. The vote went against him. I voted for them with the majority. I felt guilty for voting against Packer. When the tally was made, Packer sat motionless for 5 or 6 or 7 seconds. Every eye was fixed on him. For me, the suspense was almost unbearable. Then Packer shifted himself. The pulse of life returned, and the process went on. As I say in my biography of Packer, that was for me an endearing, defining moment in my understanding of J.I. Packer.
Wow. I'm sure so much of your life and work was into it. It's hard to just let it go.
Yep.
Wow. For us people who don't know Greek, what was that word, doulos? What's the English translation of that word?
Well, see, that's what's up for debate. Some people argue vehemently for slave, but that's not an accurate translation for our purposes because it evokes our understanding of slavery as we understand it. Bondservant is how we translated it. These people were not slaves in the sense in which we use that word. They were indentured servants. They were in employment for a set period of time. There were many privileges that went along with employment. From the documents of the time, some people argued against giving that up. So long and short of it is we translated it bondservant.
Okay.
I have reservations about that because it's not in my active vocabulary. However, I was thoroughly convinced that slave was not an accurate translation.
Okay.
So what was your role as the English stylist in these votes?
Well, on the ESV committee is a little misleadingly called English language stylist. That indeed is the title that I bore. It turned out that all of the men on the committee had excellent stylistic intuitions, and preeminently J.I. Packer, who became the chair of the translation committee. I served the committee best by being an informed generalist. Now, my expertise in the Bible as literature was a main factor here. It turned out that this specialty in something other than Hebrew and Greek was a very important factor in our translation process. It elevated me to a position that my lack of knowledge of the original languages would have made impossible. I can think of occasions when, as a generalist, I asked questions that the specialists in the original languages did not think to ask.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Very cool.
So do do you ever fear that one of your votes that you voted for, that you have skewed the text or picked the wrong one, or?
No,
Changed your mind?
no, I wouldn't say that. Let me respond to the question. How did I take it when my suggestions were rejected? I've already shared my early misconception that an English Bible translation couldn't possibly be the result of a vote. As I teach the Bible as literature to my students, I jokingly say when I come to a translation that I favored and that was rejected, it's as though I've been losing an arm. I lost an arm or a leg and I've been walking without it ever since. That's a joke. I found it acceptable to bow to the majority opinion. I'll just say that occasionally a reviewer has raked our translation over the coals, metaphorically speaking, for a given rendition, arguing, the reviewer arguing that it should have been such as I argued for. So in a sense, I have gotten my revenge occasionally. And the most notable instance is Vanity of Vanities in the book of Ecclesiastes. Apparently the committee knew that I favored the literal translation, vapor of vapors. So I was given the floor actually to make my case. J.I. Packer argued strongly for the King James Vanity of Vanities, which carried the day. I felt very good when a reviewer said this violated our essentially literal Bible translation theory. I agreed. So it was a small moment of revenge.
How many people were voting, would you say?
The committee consisted of 12 voting members.
Okay. Because then did that include the people who were, it probably didn't include the people who were making the translations. They came to you with their translation and then you approved it?
No, all the work on the translation committee was done by those 12 members. There were Old Testament chairs and New Testament chairs. They did a lot of the preliminary work, and then others, there were Old Testament and New Testament committees in addition to the chair. It was very well organized. I will say that in our very early meetings, it was laughable how we were feeling our way. I remember that at the first meeting, Lane Dennis actually read a whole chapter from Romans as though we had that degree of time at our disposal, asking if anyone wanted to raise any issue about any of the verses, and every verse elicited a request to be considered. We would have benefited from, I think, interacting with committee members of other translations just to get a feel for the degree of organization that was required. On the other hand, we quickly moved toward that degree of organization. Initially, we did not have a general chair of the translation committee. At a certain point, J.I. Packer was announced as such. And then in addition, hierarchy kicked in the following way. We had our discussion. The Old or New Testament committee chair gave his verdict. Lane Dennis, as president of Crossway Books, gave his verdict. Then J.I. Packer, as general editor of the translation, gave his verdict. Then we voted. You can't believe how that new process cleaned up the process and how much more efficient it became. It was a moment of triumph for what I call hierarchy, and I was all in favor of it.
That's great.
Awesome. So let's shift a little bit. So the title of the book I referenced is the ESV and the English Bible Legacy. And so in this book, you talk about kind of like the quality of the King James, and how the ESV is kind of in that legacy. So can you explain what is the importance of the King James in English Bible translation?
Very good question. Incidentally, I've also written a book just on the King James Version in commemoration with its 400th anniversary in 2011. I want to begin with a concession. The language of the King James Version is too archaic to make it a viable translation for most people today. I say that with a bit of regret. I was raised on the King James Version, but even I, as a student of Renaissance literature, find the King James too archaic for devotional reading. What then is the positive role of the King James? Well, we need to begin by giving honor where honor is due. The King James Bible was the Bible of the English-speaking world for 4 centuries. That will never happen again. The King James Version at that level can serve as an inspiration toward excellence, and it can serve as a model that we can follow as we update the language and scholarship behind a translation today. And I'll break that into 2 topics. It can serve as a model of the right translation philosophy. Now, we'll say more about that in a moment, so I won't say more now. Secondly, the King James Version can serve as a model for stylistic excellence. Here are some formulas under that. Dignity of language, a style that is elegant without being stilted. Beauty of expression. Aphoristic brilliance. By an aphorism, I mean a saying that is so memorable, or a phrase so memorable that it's almost impossible to forget. And along with that, a style that's commanding of our attention. So let me just summarize. Stylistically, the King James Version gives us everything we want in a Bible, except for the archaic language.
So then how do you see the ESV as carrying on that tradition?
In the preface to the ESV and in its promotional materials, it repeatedly claims to be in the Tyndale King James tradition. I myself would just make that read the King James tradition. This is in contrast to dynamic equivalent translations, which consciously distance themselves from the King James Bible. The ESV is in the King James lineage first with its translation philosophy. Every word in the Hebrew and Greek text is given a lexical equivalent, not a substitute, but an equivalent in the English translation. This is called essentially literal, and it's based on the premise that every word in the original text was inspired and needs to be retained in an English translation. Secondly, in addition to the right translation philosophy, the ESV retains the stylistic excellence of the King James Version. Whenever possible, it retains the words and rhythms of the King James translation. It believes that a sacred book should sound like a sacred book, not like the chatter at the local Starbucks or bus stop. At this level, the contrast between the ESV and other translations is not the theoretic question of whether the very words of the original authors need to be retained. Rather, when we come to the stylistic question, we're talking about a contrast between dignified and beautiful language and what I call colloquializing, by which I mean using the informal language and jargon of everyday conversation. I am even more offended by this colloquializing of the Bible than I am by the substitution of phrases in place of the very words that the authors of the Bible used. A Bible that sounds like the newspaper is given the same level of credence that we give to the newspaper. It is no surprise to me that half a century of colloquializing Bibles has produced indifference to the Bible, not only in culture, but in evangelical churches. Colloquializing translations do not command attention and respect.
So do you think the original Hebrew and Greek is kind of the same stylistic and dignified quality?
That's a technical question. I believe that the language used by the original authors was not, on balance, colloquial. But more than that, or along with that, the rhetorical forms, the handling of phraseology, the command of rhetorical devices is just patently in the text. And that elevates the Bible, in addition to the language, beyond ordinary everyday conversation.
One of the things you bring up in your book that was really interesting to me was you brought up the importance of poetic rhythm, or just rhythm in general, in a translation?
Yes, I'm glad you picked up on that. Let me just clarify it, and you intimated, although we think of rhythm as a matter of poetry, it carries over into prose as well. Rhythm refers to the smooth flow of language. This is a technical subject, so let me briefly unfold it. Smooth rhythm is achieved by a regular alternation between accented and unaccented syllables. This is called meter. Rhythm can also encompass and extend to the phraseology of a statement. The goal is smooth flow, achieved by the rise and fall of language, the technical name for which is cadence. Although an understanding of the intricacies of rhythm is technical, the recognition of rhythm is not. When the NIV appeared, I was asked by Christianity Today to subject it to literary analysis. I gave it a negative review. Much of what I said sailed right over the heads of people in the farming community in which I grew up in central Iowa. But I noted with interest that these common folk resonated with what I said about the disjointed staccato effect of the NIV. If I may return to the King James Version for a moment, a scholar once wrote that, quote, the King James translators had ears, meaning an innate sense of sound effects, including rhythm. The Renaissance that produced the King James Version was an oral culture, and we should appropriate what we can from that tradition.
Can you give us an example of kind of where you feel like the ESV or King James has good poetic rhythm?
Oh, all over the place. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. That flows smoothly according to a rhythmic pattern. Contrast it to the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, NIV and other modern translations.
How do you feel like that affects the reader's view of the text, if it's smooth or not?
Well, preeminently, when we hear the Bible read aloud, it comes out immediately. I think smoothness of meter as opposed to staccato effect is right in our consciousness when we are reading silently as well.
So this is kind of the heart, I feel like, of you really strongly advocate in your books for a literary translation.
Yes, the Bible is a literary book. At least 80% of it meets the usual criteria of being literary. An English Bible translation cannot be considered accurate and good if it does not retain the literary qualities of the Bible as written by the original authors. Let me take a very specific instance. Comparisons in the form of metaphors and similes are a staple of poetry. For example, in Psalm 1, verse 1, we are told that the godly person does not walk in the way of sinners or sit in the seat of scoffers. A literary translation retains those comparisons and expects readers to do what the original authors expected, namely, figure out how A is like B. Dynamic equivalent translations have declared war on the metaphors and similes of the Bible. They make it clear in their prefaces and promotional materials and translations that they assume that readers cannot interpret figures of speech, so they spell out their preferred interpretations of the comparisons.
Do you think there's place for more thought-for-thought translations then, or are you just advocate for word only?
The only use I can see for a dynamic equivalent thought-for-thought translation is as a commentary on the Bible. Occasionally, I resort to them for purposes of interpretation. I think it totally misleads an English Bible reader to have a substitute placed before them and not realize that this is something other than what the original authors wrote. I refer to a dynamic equivalent Bible as a virtual Bible or a substitute Bible, not what the original authors wrote.
So before we move on here, I want you to give the chance that you wrote co-wrote with your son the Literary Study Bible.
You are right. I do want to talk about it. The Bible is a literary book. Making that case and exploring its ramifications have constituted half of my scholarly career. It is with a sense of defeat that I end my half century of labors in this corner of the vineyard. In the 1980s and 90s, it appeared that both the literary world and the Guild of Biblical Scholars were ready to embrace and actually practice literary analysis of the Bible. The promise remains unfulfilled, partly because the Biblical Scholarly Guild is a closed one that assumes that literary scholars have nothing to bring to the table of biblical interpretation. It was with a small sense of triumph, therefore, that I had the good fortune of Crossways publishing the Literary Study Bible, edited by my son and me. This literary Bible provides literary introductions to all of the books of the Bible, and more importantly, literary commentary on every passage in the Bible. This commentary appears right at the head of a passage as a lead-in to it. The Literary Study Bible is a one-stop store in regard to the literary nature of the Bible. It could as well be called a reader's Bible as a study Bible, because it actually guides a reader's experience of the text, whereas conventional study Bibles are research books that answer our questions and perplexity about this or that detail. I think conventional study Bibles are greatly overrated. They do not give help in actually interacting with the text of the Bible.
So the book is, I'm looking at it right now, just the ESV text with your notes inserted.
Yes, the critical apparatus, as it's called in the scholarly world, is elaborate. There are introductory essays for the Bible as a whole. There are literary introductions, quite extensive, to every book of the Bible. And incidentally, I managed to collect those and publish them as a freestanding book for Crossway. I think the heart of the book, though, is these blocks of lead-in commentary to the passage that immediately follows. As I read the Bible after supper for my wife and me, I read the introductions, also the lead-ins in the Literary Study Bible, and then the text. They work together beautifully.
Yeah, that looks like a great resource to have.
Yeah. We'll put links to these books and stuff in the
In
the
descriptions and things.
Oh, fantastic.
But we've already heard many of your comments in this direction, but how would you counsel somebody who doesn't know which translation to use?
Well, I frankly refer them to my books. I tell them that the only accurate translation is one that seeks to give us the closest English equivalent for every word in the original text. And I state the importance of stylistic excellence and smooth rhythm.
Is there a competitor to the ESV in your mind?
No. The American Standard Version and the New American Standard Version meet the criterion of being essentially literal. They don't come close to meeting the criterion of stylistic excellence in the King James tradition. Let me say regarding the degree to which dynamic equivalence swept the field in the mid-20th century, they never won a debate in open contest. There was just a paradigm shift. So there was a kind of Gadarene rush to colloquialism and playing free with the actual words of the original. And I think the result is almost what we could predict, a kind of not knowing what the Bible actually says. I'm glad that the ESV is a high-ranking competitor. I think the third highest selling translation, and the case can be made, it is the most widely disseminated English translation in the world at large. I'm very grateful for that.
So you use, well, just tell us about which translation do you use and what does this look like in your personal Bible reading?
Yeah, I use the ESV. I was raised in the King James Version, sometimes in a kind of mood of nostalgia. I go back to the King James, try to read it for daily devotions. It's just too archaic. I will say I love dipping into the King James as part of my literary scholarship and tracking down allusions. When I arrived at Wheaton College in 1968, in the circles in which I moved, I was quickly channeled to the Harper Study Bible, which used the RSV or Revised Standard Version as the text. The RSV was the best successor to the King James Version until the ESV appeared. And in fact, the RSV was the starting point for the ESV. The rule of operation was that the RSV could be changed only if there was a compelling reason to change it. Although many members of the ESV committee had been users of the RSV, in view of how much we changed it, J.I. Packer was right when he said one day that the RSV was not quite as good as we had thought it to be. I think that did emerge. Still, I look back with fondness to my blue-covered Harper Study Bible. Now, as for my own Bible reading, I'm going to answer the question of what it's like with an anecdote. When my son became a pastor at 10th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, he was the designated preacher at the evening services. He quickly established the practice of assembling an add-on informal meeting for anyone who wished to discuss the evening sermon or other matters. Once when I was attending one of these sessions, Philip said something that had been true for me through the years, but I didn't fully recognize it. Philip said that the Bible can enter our lives in many ways, not simply in devotional reading, and that all of these are equally valid. My most frequent contact with the Bible comes from my daily scholarly routine. I'm a teacher of literature, and that brings me into continuous contact with the Bible. I teach the Bible as literature. I'm an author on numerous subjects, and on all of them, I relate the topics continuously to the Bible. I attend church and Sunday school, where the primary text is the Bible. So there are many ways in which what we call Bible reading can enter our lives. Having said that, I'm often surprised at how much of the Bible is in my mind. In my case, it is a matter of line upon line in my daily occupation and life, and I have to add, from my childhood. I would encourage people who are not giants of daily Bible reading not to feel inferior. There are many ways in which the Bible can enter our lives. I say that with just a little guilt because my daily routine as a teacher and author give me exposure to the Bible that most people's life on the job does not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I find it hard sometimes where like I'm the same way where I'm using the Bible a lot in my studies. Do you have to like separate in your mind between kind of like listening to God in your, in your devotional times versus like I'm, making an argument or trying to convince or trying to understand the text, in the more scholarly side of things?
I have never felt that dichotomy, though I know that biblical scholars somewhat regularly speak of it. For me, it's all integrated. Now, I have to add, I'm not a scholarly exegete. Nonetheless, I do write about the Bible in scholarship. No, I find that my scholarly and devotional contact with the Bible is cut from the same cloth. Both support each other, and I'm very grateful for that degree of integration.
That's amazing. Awesome. Sounds like you have a lot of experience and respect for the word, and that's just very comforting to hear.
I come from that unsophisticated background, but it was a tradition, a Dutch tradition, where the Bible was read 3 times a day after every meal. I look back on that and think, that could create problems also. And nonetheless, it did give me this line upon line contact with the Bible. Mm-hmm. And in addition, I attended Christian schools, so that gave me a lot more exposure to the Bible.
Yeah. Awesome. We don't have any more questions, but do you have anything else you want to add or say?
No, you did an excellent job of laying out questions. It was well thought out. That's one of my highest commendations, incidentally. So you really are to be commended.
Thanks for your time. We appreciate it so much. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Bible Toolbox. For more information and resources about the content covered in this episode, visit our website. If you have a Bible tool that you'd like us to discuss, leave a comment on our YouTube page or email us at thebibletoolbox@gmail.com.